This year, we're going to be focusing on relationship in its many forms as a primary portal of spiritual awakening. In times like these, with so much uncertainty, so much challenge and danger in the air, we need one another more than ever before. Shortly after 9/11, I interviewed the ex-president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, about what she had learned about moving through dangerous, tumultuous periods, such as the Troubles in her own country. And she responded by quoting an old Irish proverb. She said, "It is in each other's shadow that we flourish. It is in each other's shadow that we flourish." What Robinson was saying is that it's in the darkest times that we need reminding of interconnection as the foundation of moral and spiritual life, and that what unites us is infinitely stronger than the forces of hatred, delusion, and fear that threaten to tear us apart. In fact, this is the upside of crisis, you could say, to shake us up from the illusion of autonomy and separation and remind us that when the chips are down, we can't survive as selfish, self-involved creatures. It's just not possible to thrive on the path of uncertainty without focusing on meaningful relationships, not only with others and with Source, call it God, spiritual reality, Buddha nature, but also with ourselves. So, what does it mean to cultivate a meaningful, supportive, and wise relationship with yourself? That's what we're going to be exploring in the January-February program. What is the practice of self-love exactly? And how is it different from arrogance, from narcissism, and selfishness? The first important point to understand is that self-love isn't possible using only the ego. Self-love is not possible using only the ego. In fact, the ego is incapable of self-love. The ego, the personality, the story-driven identity, is much too insecure and slippery, also too easily offended and conditional to be counted on as a dependable ally when it comes to the practice of self-love. Relying on your ego for self-love is a little bit like depending on a distracted, bratty child to provide you with unconditional affection and attention. It's a losing battle that is sure to be disappointing. You simply can't derive the kind of self-love you long for, that we all long for, from a tantruming infant that can barely see beyond its own needs. The ego, the imaginary narrative identity that's composed of thoughts, desires, memories, biases, aversion, pride, and shame, is just not up to the job of self-love. To access the dimension of yourself that is up to that job requires aiming your attention at the part of you that's beyond your story, beyond personality, and the body-mind identity. The witnessing, self-aware I that is always observing your thoughts without looking away or judging you, a clear-eyed awareness that simply witnesses. This transcendental part, let's call it the self with a capital S, isn't subject to the ego's limitations. Its attention and affection are not conditional. It stands outside the Sturm und Drang of experience, the 10,000 things that flesh is heir to, and it abides there in being, silently watching, available, and clear. This larger self has no need of self-forgiveness because it doesn't hold a grudge. It doesn't fuel itself with stories or divide your world in two, but instead supports you as the ground of being. It's present for you at any time when you slow down enough and get quiet enough to hear it. The self doesn't need you to change anything in order to feel self-love. Unlike the ego that's focused on fixing and comparing and reacting, approaching, avoiding, liking, disliking. The nature of this larger self is open, luminous, and tender, like the eyes of a mother gazing at her beloved child. There's a parable I love, which I've shared before in the Seeker's Forum, that describes the unawakened person as a child in its mother's lap, crying uncontrollably. The baby's kicking its legs and wailing, feeling like the world is against it. It keeps screaming for a long, long time until finally, hopefully, the child looks up and sees the eyes of the mother who has been holding it all along. When the child sees the mother's eyes, this story goes, and realizes that he's always connected to her, he stops crying. And when the child stops crying and sees its mother's smile, looking down at him in her lap, the child learns to smile too. The ego is a lot like this squalling child, imagining it's alone in the world, fighting its lonely fight, dropped into a strange land from which it can't seem to find its way home. Rather than look to this least secure part of ourselves for a strong foundation of self-love, we're wise to turn this equation around and love the wounded ego using the power of the larger self, which is expansive and flexible enough to contain the ego's rage and fear. This larger self can allow the ego to settle down slowly, to recognize where it has always been, and wake up from its bad dream of the self-hating I, the little me that is never enough. As seekers, we learn to accept the impermanence of this make-believe self, however uncomfortable that may be, and to train our awareness on the self that transcends concepts and stories, this witnessing, illuminating awareness that we are, that's actually the source of our being. We train in mindful awareness in order to reveal the primordial heart of this larger self, and to focus it on the places where we feel broken, scared, ashamed, offended. Not to deny them in any way, or constrict ourselves against them, but to bless our ego self gently, just like a loving mother holding a child and stroking its head. When we shift toward inhabiting this larger self, we notice that the power dynamics begin to shift in our lives as well. We're no longer quite as much at the effect of other people and outside situations. You're no longer looking outside yourself automatically for satisfaction or happiness. Nor are you the victim when you feel disappointed or lose your self-worth, when you appear less than perfect in the eyes of others. When you're grounded in this enlarged state of heart and mind, you're no longer threatened by your deficiencies. Instead, you understand and accept the conditions of the material world and stop seeking security where it can't be found. Instead, you learn to rest in the groundlessness of being, where, paradoxically, you come to locate your most reliable strength. Pema Chodron, the Tibetan Buddhist teacher, speaks very beautifully on this subject of groundlessness and how empowering it is to give up hope of locating final happiness or love in the outside world. As Pema says, quote, "Anyone who stands on the edge of the unknown, fully in the present without reference point, experiences groundlessness. To stay with that shakiness, to stay with a broken heart, with a rumbling stomach, with the feeling of hopelessness and wanting to get revenge, that is the path of true awakening. Sticking with that uncertainty, getting the knack of relaxing in the midst of chaos, learning not to panic, that is the spiritual path," unquote. It's also the path to authentic self-love, which requires that we accept the limitations of our existence, including our own impermanence. Now, it can sound counterintuitive to the ego's ear that being aware of groundlessness and aware of mortality more generally is necessary for self-love, but that is the simple truth. Unless you're aware of impermanence, you'll be placing your hopes and fears in a fictional identity, a false self that's forever contradicting itself, letting you down, and also moving the goalpost of happiness. This false self tells you when you lose the weight, get the better job, please your family, achieve the goal, then you can finally love yourself. If you just jump through that hoop and learn this new lesson and master sitting on a cushion without moving for an hour, then maybe you'll be worthy of your own affection. But what kind of love is that? What kind of love? How much is love worth that abandons you when you're less than ideal? As Shakespeare wrote in Sonnet 116, love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. Love isn't love which alters when it alteration finds. For self-love to be real, you must be able to love yourself at your worst, at your lowest, when you're down and out, at the end of your rope, with nothing to give and no strength to perform in order to be loved. Genuine self-love manifests in humility, not pride, in vulnerability, not performance, in shamelessness, not in keeping up appearances. I often quote Thomas Merton's challenging observation that, quote, prayer and love are learned in the moment when prayer becomes impossible and the heart has turned to stone. Prayer and love are learned in the moment when prayer becomes impossible and the heart has turned to stone. The love that Merton was referring to is the love that issues from this larger self that is sourced in the ground of being, the self that's beyond the confines of the ego. Merton knew that nothing but this self is expansive enough to have room for the roiling mess of the ego, this disjointed little me that's always at risk of falling apart. Teachers like Pema Chodron encourage us to let this imaginary self fall apart. Let it. Deconstruct it by all means. Traditions that believe in the essential goodness of human beings, like Buddhism, instruct us to bless our fragile egos while being mindful of their fictional nature. These traditions teach us to notice the insecurity of the self-created story and practice feeling the groundlessness beneath the ego's awareness. Now, this isn't comforting exactly, but it is the price that we all pay for awakening. We simply can't claim to want liberation or spiritual awareness while simultaneously being unwilling to release our hold on the ego and the faith that we invest in the fictional false self. The fictional self, the one that cannot love, the personality that can never quite hold itself in true affection for long, must eventually be seen and understood for what it is without resistance or excuses. Instead of focusing on fixing this false self, shoring up its deficiencies, filling its blanks, imagining that when we finally get it just right, we'll finally be truly happy, we're much wiser to focus on the larger self that doesn't need fixing, and through that, bring attention to the wounds of the ego. As you detach from and cease identifying with this ego story as the imaginary container for your life, your pain actually decreases and you have more access to generosity, to vitality, and to self-love. False pride, meaning pride in your ego self, also begins to shrink, along with shame and the aversion to self-love. When the ego's self-critical thoughts do arise, you meet them not with defensiveness, but with care. Instead of piling on and telling yourself how bad you really are, you resist the urge to make things worse and recognize self-demeaning thoughts, as wisps of negative belief attaching themselves to who you believe you are. No matter how far you progress on a spiritual path, you're never free of these whispers completely, the ones that tell you that you're simply not good enough. And to imagine that you will be free completely of self-criticism is a form of perfectionism or spiritual idealism, thinking that you'll reach some point of undisturbable equanimity where you never again dislike yourself. It just doesn't happen. I like what Ram Dass said about this. He said, quote, "After many years of undergoing psychoanalysis, teaching psychology, working as a psychotherapist, taking drugs, being in India, being a yogi, having a guru, and meditating for decades, As far as I can see, I haven't gotten rid of a single neurosis. Not one. The only thing that has changed is that they don't define me anymore. There's less energy invested in my personality, so it is easier to change. My neuroses are not huge monsters anymore. Now they're like little schmoos, unquote. So, how do we practice self-love? How do we engage deeply with this practice? There's really no better tool to cultivate than what Buddhists call maitri, which is a loving kindness or friendliness or benevolence. In the practice challenge for this program, I'll be giving you more instructions for how to cultivate maitri, which I highly recommend you experiment with as much as possible in these next few weeks. The benefits of maitri practice can be enormous, and there's even a growing body of scientific research attesting to the value of loving kindness practice, and I look forward to hearing how this works for you. So that's what I wanted to say to you as an introduction to our program about self-love. And now I'd like you please to take 20 minutes to write about whether you feel aversion to parts of yourself. Do you feel aversion to parts of yourself? If so, what are they? And if you don't, why don't you? How have you come to be so self-accepting? Try to be as specific as possible, please. We'll take 20 minutes. 10 minutes in, Jay will open up the breakout rooms. If you would like to join a group and connect with some members, that's absolutely fine. Otherwise, just keep on writing. And I will be chiming in with some deepening prompts during this exercise. 20 minutes, please.